Welcome to the Prof Talk Pod, brought to you by the Engaged Professor. Every 2 weeks, join us as we talk about tips and tricks to help you connect with your students, engage with industry, and stay up to date on all the teaching trends. We'll give you actionable strategies that will help improve your teaching today. Thank you for being here. Let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Prof Talk Pod. This is episode 11, and my name is Becky Aiken. I'm here with my friend and colleague, Galen Clavio.
Hi.
It, Today, we're going to talk about having difficult conversations in our classrooms with our students. I feel like the world is a little crazy right now. Yeah,
A
here and
little.
there.
It depends. Certainly it's been an awkward last couple of months in terms of how we normally have conversations on certain things, and that's probably only going to continue as we move ahead.
And I just think there's been a lot of rapid change across a lot of aspects of life in the last, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 months.
Yeah.
And I don't know, as I was thinking about things we should talk about on the podcast, I do a statement every year at the beginning of my classes that just kind of shares with students, tries to focus their brain a little bit on sometimes we talk about things in this class that you might not agree with. And here's how we approach those conversations so that they can be impactful and also civil. And I feel like the last couple weeks, so for me, classes started on Tuesday of last week. I think the same for you, Galen, or did you start the week before that?
The week before.
Yeah. So I think for me, the first couple weeks, students are feeling a little bit off from what I remember the fall being like. And they're asking questions I don't necessarily know answers to. And so that kind of popped up into my head that I am anticipating having some interesting conversations, probably partially because one of the classes I'm teaching this spring is called Icons and Influence in the Age of Social Media. And we started our discussions talking about who we think are the most influential people. And there were a lot of differing opinions on that topic. I think it's one of those topics or one of those areas that it's highly subjective, and so students had different feelings about it. And it reminded me of some conversations I've had to manage over the years in classes. And I remember being a new faculty member the first time a student said something where I was like, um Hmm. I'm not exactly sure where to take this because I know that this could be a topic that gets people, very passionate and emotional. And in sport management, we talk about things like transgender participation in sport that tends to have a lot of people have differing opinions or perspectives on. And so I've always been interested in this topic of how do we approach that in classrooms. I don't know if that's something that you've run across in your time as a teacher, Galen.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's funny because working in sports from a teaching perspective, I think people get the idea that all we talk about is like what goes on in the games, or something silly like that. Not that that's silly. I actually think that that's good things to talk about, but it's always perceived like, well, why would you have to have uncomfortable conversations? But whether you're talking about something with academics that's you're not familiar with, or there's conflict in the classroom, or there's something going on that's completely external to the materials but is on your students' minds, that happens, I think, a lot. And I mean, sometimes it's conversations that are happening in the classroom with a group of people. Sometimes it's a conversation that's happening after class with one individual in the classroom. Sometimes it's something that's happening in your office. I think just in general, it's one of the many things that it is highly unfortunate that we don't do a better job of training aspiring professors on. It's kind of like, I remember back in the 80s and 90s in television, one of the big tropes in whenever you had like a medical drama was this idea of like, as I fix my hair here, since I had like a random strand that wasn't doing what I wanted to do. But the idea of the doctor that didn't have good bedside manner, who would come in and just kind of like tell a patient they had terminal cancer like they were telling somebody that like they got a parking ticket. It's there's a lot of that I think happens in the classroom where you're expected to draw off of both being an authority on what's going on with the situation, but also some level of empathy. And as you and I have talked about many times, empathy and other, you know, social emotions aren't always the I wouldn't grade people that go into faculty roles as having necessarily an A+ grade in those things sometimes. And so it is something that you kind of get adapted to. But a lot of times there's not a lot of training or even a lot of discussion about what to do in those circumstances because rarely does that come up in an orientation session.
Well, and I sometimes think a little bit by default because of the, professor student relationship. I find that students often will look to me for my opinions or thoughts or guidance on topics that aren't necessarily relevant to the class but are external because, they view us as having more life experience, which is, mostly true for undergraduates, sometimes not for adult learners or graduate students. And so sometimes you're like not expecting them to ask you a question about something that is outside of the field that you were talking about. Or sometimes if sports are, really ingrained in society. So lots of societal issues or connections can be made and they might not be directly what you're talking about, but students kind of want to know how you think or feel because they're still trying to figure out oftentimes what they think or feel.
It's funny because the state of Indiana just passed a law that essentially is trying to keep you from doing that as a professor. It's called SEA 202, where honestly, providing life advice or providing your perspective on something not directly related to the topic of the course at hand, it could actually be considered a violation of of the statute, and people can complain. It's great times here, let me tell you. But no, you're right. I mean, I think it's funny, you go through, and I'm going to put like the like lecturers and people who get hired as professors of practice out of industry aside for the moment and focus really on tenure line professors. You go to you get your master's degree, you spend a lot of time getting your PhD, then you get a job as a faculty member, and a lot of times you're still thinking of yourself as essentially not being any different than the student that you just were. Yet now you're in front of a class and you are viewed as maybe not immediately as an authority figure per se, but certainly as someone who should be looked to as potentially having things that would be worthwhile for the student to know and understand about life. You're right. And so I do believe that you have to find a spot where you feel comfortable. And we've talked about this a lot with some other things in this podcast series before, where people get themselves in trouble, I think, is when they try to be something that they're not, and when they feel compelled to do things that maybe they're not only comfortable with but don't have a lot of practice with. And a lot of times when you are approached by students with uncomfortable topics, or when you have to talk about something in class that may be uncomfortable, you may yourself not be comfortable with talking about that. And in some cases, I think it's actually best for you to say, I'm actually not comfortable talking about this in this venue. Maybe we should come back if you can. If it's, and again, this is where the differentiation between, is this a general, like non-course related or non-education related issue that a student is bringing to you, or a group of students is bringing to you, like, hey, what do you think about this? There's ways to kind of deflect that and say, hey, well, I don't have time to talk about it, or maybe, I'd like to read more about it before I say something. Even if you know things but you just don't want to say them, that's important. With education related items, if it's uncomfortable, if you've got a student accused of plagiarism, or if you've got a student that got kicked out of their group because they weren't doing work and they want to talk about it at the beginning of class, I think one of the things you have to do is give yourself some time to figure out, how am I going to approach this topic? A lot of times, I don't think that we, as educators, we're not always the best at talking entirely off the cuff on things we haven't prepared for. And so this is one of those situations where, you want to give yourself some space, and you want to make sure that you don't say something that isn't true or that you might regret saying, simply because you feel compelled to say something. And I think that's where a lot of people get themselves in trouble. It's better to say, hey, let's talk about this, but I want to set a time up so that I can make sure I've got all my notes together and that I can give you a full answer, rather than trying to come up with something off the cuff and getting yourself into a hole that you then have to dig out of later.
Well, there is an important distinction there between maybe some personal student related issues that maybe they would bring to your office hours. I think every year since I started teaching, I'm getting more and more students who are divulging, very personal, impactful things that are happening in their lives. And those are certainly the conversations where, I mean, I was definitely not prepared early on as a faculty member to know how to navigate, and hopefully a university has some good training on where to send them for resources. There's a couple ways that you could handle those conversations. There's things you need to say about being a mandated reporter in some situations, but for some faculty, maybe the most comforting thing you can do is say, I am not qualified for this personal life situation, but I can give you resources that the
Right.
university offers to help you. And that way you don't feel, if you're compelled to say something, that's like a good backup. If you feel like it's something that you want to provide more on, then like you said, it could be a start there. And then
Yeah.
if this is something you want to circle back to, that's fine. I certainly have had students who viewed me, especially when I had grad students. I think there is a difference often
Mhm.
between undergraduate and grad students in these personal issue, personal experience conversations that, we became more mentor mentee relationship, and life suggestions became a part of it,
Right.
and that was great, but that's not always going to be the case, and that's certainly not the case for everybody. Some people really like to draw the line between these are the things appropriate to talk about and these things you need to go elsewhere. And of course, we also have to be careful about the personal issues that we, don't want to give advice on that is not based in evidence that we have training to give
Right.
in some ways. So I think that's definitely like one area that it can be really difficult to navigate as a new faculty member for sure.
Yeah, it's tough. And again, I think a lot of it really comes down to your own individual personality traits and how you communicate socially with other people. The where I've landed over the course of my career has been, there's going to be times when students just want to get another opinion. There's not a whole lot else behind it. Increasingly, as outside forces try to make the educational environment more adversarial, as we see with the bill I just talked about that got introduced in Indiana, and with the way that the questioning of the authority of faculty members and professors in anything, not just this, as that becomes more central to the messaging, so to speak, around education. I think there's a natural tendency on the part of especially younger professors to back off from saying anything outside of the confines of what's going on in the class. And I think, again, you have to find your comfort level and you have to understand how to approach things based upon the context of the conversation. Most of the time, I think as we go through the different itinerations of what you might be addressing with students or what they might bring to the table, they will oftentimes try to get a sense from you about what you're willing and able to talk about, what you would be interested to speak on. And a lot of times I think the most evocative instructors, the ones that are the most animated in class, people tend to think, oh, this person will talk about anything. And that may not actually be the case. Just like if your teaching style is more reserved, it's more quiet, if you're very very kind of like, here's what we're going to go over and that's it in your approach, a lot of times that ends up kind of detouring people from having the impetus to ask those types of questions in the first place. But and sometimes that's a bad thing. Like one of the things that I think we run into, and it's a fine line. Like if you think about the professor student relationship, what is it? Like, how do you define it within the confines of what we do on a daily basis? Because it's not straightforward all the time. It's not simply like, well, you go in and you're just teaching this thing and that's it. And that's rarely ever how it works. And if you try to teach like that and you try to treat it like, so you're taking someone's order at a restaurant and then coming back and then delivering the meal, and the meal is the lecture, and then you leave again, you're gonna the teaching evaluations are bad. They'll be like, this professor was not very good to listen to. They weren't very conversant. So I think a lot of it now, it's again, I think splitting to some degree what we talk about when we say uncomfortable conversations. or uncomfortable topics or interactions that are outside of the normal boundaries of what we would normally have in the classroom versus things that are, that you're talking about that are within those boundaries. I think that's interesting. And this is where I always think about, like in the sports realm, like a sports and society class or a sports media and society class. I think if you're teaching that sort of a class correctly, you're going to come up, you're going to be bringing forward topics and environments and things that are uncomfortable to some people. And I think part of it is in that sense, in the lecturer sense, if you know that something's going to be potentially controversial, and I see this in other areas too. Like as an undergrad director, we deal with this a lot with film. It's like we're going to show a film, and increasingly, it's been like, well, you need trigger warnings ahead of time, or you need this or that. And it's like, well, a lot of faculty are like, no, we don't want to do that because the whole idea is not, well, sorry, you don't have to watch this if it might disturb you. It's like, this is something you need to watch because it's potentially disturbing, and we need to talk about the ramifications of that. That in and of itself is a difficult thing. So going back to the sports and society conversations, you're going to talk about race and racism. You're going to talk about sex and sexism. You're going to talk about power structures and how there's labor and things like that interact with ownership, and there's some things in there that are intrinsically sometimes uncomfortable, especially since at most of the institutions that we're at, you're exposing students to ideas and thoughts and concepts that maybe they've never been exposed to before. You have to act as the translator for that. And so if you're teaching in those areas, I think it's important to understand that your perspective is not their perspective, and approaching it, where I think people get into trouble is when they approach it from the perspective like, my perspective is the right one, my perspective is the accurate one to try to approach this topic. That can be off-putting, and that can lead to more uncomfortable conversations because people don't feel like you've given other points of view the venue that they need. So you have to be careful with that. If you're dealing with that's where it gets interesting to me, and that's where I think as we try to work through how to have conversations around the in-class stuff, you have to build it in from the beginning in terms of how you prep for it and what you're expecting to get back from students as you're going through those processes.
When I think that you said something really important there is maybe that the setup of the discussion in the first place is to even, remind students that everybody in that classroom comes from different perspectives and has different lived experiences, and we don't try in our we're not going to try in our classroom to determine whose lived experience is more important or more relevant than the others. We're just going to be here to try to understand and consider. And for me, I always kind of set guidelines for students when, especially when I know the conversation could skew to something very heated. And I didn't do this early on. It took me a few years to really learn this, but I try to set a guideline of, you know, nobody is required to change their mind, but everybody is required to consider that what they've always believed to be true might not be true. And that includes me. And so
Mhm.
then it becomes, I try to disarm a little bit that expectation that I'm going to tell them the right answer, because most things, first of all, don't have a right answer.
Right.
And two, I think that that might be a little bit, help them see that that's not what this is about, so that we can take a little bit of our emotion out of it and try to consider it from, you know, fact information based perspectives. And I usually like to message that that is a way to think about how you approach conversations outside of university. Like, this is not a skill that is just helpful in my classroom. This is a skill in learning how to have productive conversations and stop, period, in your relationships,
Mhm.
to not just, and in your work, and in the future of whatever organizations you are a part of in society or in your community, because that developing understanding and considering multiple perspectives is such a valuable skill and something that really appears to be missing right now. So for me, that's
Well,
been like a really important piece.
it's interesting. You're right. I think that's all very important. It's also, I think it's difficult for some in the classroom as instructors to create an environment where everybody is participating in what you just said, because I feel like we've gotten to an interesting point where the whatever the majority is within your class setting is like or whatever the whole idea of the power dynamic thing within society is one that I think is needs more debate than sometimes it gets, because the idea is, well, this group of people who are in the majority need to listen to the concerns of everybody else, and those are the viewpoints that matter, and everything else just kind of sits within this exist, like, well, hey, you need to be exposed to these things. We've seen this a lot the last 20 years in a lot of the approaches to education, but really everybody in the class generally needs to be on the same page in terms of being open to the perspectives, and that is a really tough thing to accomplish. And I think if you're doing your job as an instructor or as a professor, you you might think that there are some objective truths here, but you have the advantage of a significant amount of world experience and reading and consuming information that's given you where you're at. And a lot of times your students, they just don't have that. And so it's really, you have to put yourself back in, what were you at 18 or 19, and what were your perspectives, and understand that there are a lot of things you need to be open to, but that really needs to be everybody. And I think where a lot of times these sorts of difficult conversations get into danger territory for professors is when they only expect a small percentage of the class to listen to everybody else's opinions, and that is a real problem sometimes in terms of how this stuff gets processed, and whether you end up coming across as an impartial arbiter or someone who's helping to guide the conversation versus someone who's basically dictating what the end thought should be. That sometimes can make things harder than it should be in terms of how these conversations go along.
And one thing to consider is if it's a conversation that's important in the context of your class, then my recommendation and perspective is, as a faculty member, you have a duty to understand the different perspectives, so that if one group is seeming to dominate the conversation and try to get the other group to agree with them, then it's your job to steer the conversation, even if it's not the way you think or feel or believe, so that all the perspectives are heard, and even introduce perspectives that maybe there's not usually only two perspectives, to be
Mhm.
clear, right? There's usually five, six, seven,
Oh yeah.
20, who knows, depending on the topic. So your job is to be versed enough to introduce things that students maybe didn't already say.
Right.
And for me, my best case outcome is when a student leaves my class and says, Dr. Aiken, I don't know what you think. And I say, great, that's the point. I don't want you to know what I think, not because I'm not willing to share, but because I don't want to be guiding the situation the way that I think. That's not the purpose of this conversation.
See, I actually approach it differently now. I used to do that. I would be like, I would really pride myself on not giving my opinion. What I try to do in these circumstances is I try to set the topic up. I try to engage some conversation. It's generally the people that feel the most passionate that start to talk in that environment, which is not always what I'm
Mhm.
aiming for, but that's always how it works out. But then
Yeah.
what I do, I'll let the students talk for a little bit and go back and forth. And what I'll normally do is I'll jump in after a few exchanges, especially if it gets a little bit testy, which sometimes it does. Most of the time it does, and most of the students don't really want to fight with each other. And I will go ahead and say, well, here's really where the perspectives are coming from based upon what I've seen, and I'll try to give a relatively full explanation of, like, well, here's this perspective, here's another perspective, maybe there's a third one, and then I'll say, like, where I land on it is here, but here's why. And I always try to include, like, here's the background and context I have in terms of my perspectives on these. And a lot of times I'll be like, I used to think differently, and this is often the case. And then these experiences or these things caused me gradually to change my mind, or I added this perspective that I didn't have before. I think that, and I felt this way when I was a college student. I always was like, how did this person, like, get into their job? What was the sequence of events that got them to where they were at and got them thinking the way that they thought? And some people wear that on their sleeve in the classroom, and their entire identity is based in that. And I don't do that. What I do instead is I try to approach it and say, I want you to understand why I came to the conclusion I came to. And I want you to understand that I've already changed my mind on this once, and my feelings might evolve again in the future. And I find that, what I really want people to do as you said, with there being 5 or 6 different perspectives, is at least understand that there are other perspectives and that you're likely to change your mind as time goes by. And it's not a badge of honor to dig in on the same perspective when you're 18 years old and keep that for the rest of your life. If you're doing that, that you're essentially engaging in a level of universal truth that I don't necessarily think exists all the time, because most of these topics change. I was having this conversation the other day where we were talking about movies from like the 90s, and a movie got brought up, and it was like, God, there were all these like really bad jokes that were really like what we would consider to be very offensive, and it was set up in a way that wasn't that. And I was like, you've got to understand like the context of the time. So I was talking about smoking today. Like I used to smoke cigarettes, and um we heard a guest speaker in somebody's class that I was observing today, and they talked about how they had smoked, and it was like, if you were of a certain age, it wasn't that big of a deal until it became a big deal. And like little things like that, where it's like there's this big shift in perspective. That doesn't necessarily mean that the prior perspectives were wrong, but they were contextually what they were at the time. And I think trying to get people to understand that these things do change, and you do have situations where things that happened 30, 40 years ago look horrific now, but they're, at the time it was just like whatever. It's what it is, or we celebrated it. I think that that's oftentimes the context that students are missing, and it's a lot of times that the context that like textbooks are missing or readings are missing, because most of the time a reading is going to be written from a particular perspective. It's normally pushing a particular type of agenda. You want people to have that understanding, but you don't want them to necessarily just digest that verbatim, like, I must think this way.
When I think really a lot of what you're talking about is modeling the process, the thought process, to show that this is not a static pursuit. I think that is really, really important in our classrooms. And one way to take difficult conversations and make them, I think, bigger than the issue at hand, which sometimes diffuses the emotional part. Like if we can remove the emotion by explaining why it matters to think about where our thought processes come from and how they evolve, it becomes less about right or wrong way to think and more about, oh wow, this is a process. I've never thought about it as a process that might evolve. So that's a really good, I think that's such a good suggestion. I think that takes a little bit more finesse. And I would say, if a student directly asked me if what my opinion was, I would tell them and then tell them why, similar to how you do. But that skill to summarize the arguments, the amount of focus that takes for a faculty member is pretty incredible, I think. I mean, as I think about, you might get really good at it. And so that's one thing that is maybe you can strive toward or work toward and practice in conversations with colleagues so that you can
Mhm.
get better at it in front of groups. Because I think that is a really important skill that takes some honing.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Sometimes your colleagues are not going to be the best people to practice this on, because I mean,
They
realistic,
have
and
opinions.
well, what I find fascinating about a lot of faculty is so many of them are so dug in on what they believe and are advocates for particular points of view. And that, to me, to a large degree, is like a holdover from the research agendas that many of the folks in various disciplines have, not just sports management. It happens everywhere. But um, rather than research being like free inquiry and trying to figure out like what, is this actually the case? So much research that I read and review starts at the end point and then tries to work backwards in defense of something, and I really get turned off by that, and I find that sometimes in the classroom too, and that's where I think sometimes faculty get themselves in trouble, because when stuff like this comes in, they will just categorically state, well, this is how this is, and that ends up creating a situation where I don't think you're doing the students, you're not giving them what they need, because as much as we are supposed to convey information to students, we're really supposed to try to help them think about the information and process it and filter it through their realities, and understand that there are other realities that they also should probably be considering, even if they don't ultimately end up agreeing with the things that come out of those realities. So I don't know who you practice it on at that point. I think if you are the type of person who wants to be that way in the classroom, It's where listening to actual open debates sometimes can really be helpful because you can take some of those skills and bring them into the classroom. Because look, I'm a very gray area person when it comes to like what is actual, like what is truth and what is not, and how do we actually approach these things, which not everybody is, and that's fine. But if if you're going to do things with your students where you're trying to get them up to a higher level of evaluating things and where they're synthesizing different viewpoints and trying to really come up with a good set of ideas to build their own viewpoints off of, I think it's an important process.
And I think that is all very important as we think about, part of the goal when we started this podcast was just really think critically about how we teach and consider teaching maybe as from a broader perspective. As I thought about the content to create with the engaged professor, like it was really about how do we rethink teaching as more than information transfer. So what you just described is such a good example of how we move beyond information transfer. And these don't even have to be like super contentious issues, right? Like these kind of conversations are important for even what you might consider the most basic concept in your discipline,
Mhm.
but
Yeah.
understanding a different perspective or where it came from is really important. So, before we're going long, I knew we would on this one. But before we kind of move to our closing, I just wanted to mention that there is an option if somebody brings up a topic that isn't necessarily relevant to your class and you aren't either in a space to talk about it because you don't have as much expertise as you feel you need, or it's something that you simply don't think has a place in your classroom. It Don't be afraid to say I understand that that's something that's important to you and is impacting the world around us. I don't think that it is relevant in the context of our class. And so if this is a discussion that you would like to have with me individually, or if you would like me to help connect you with somebody who would be better at having that conversation with you, I'm happy to do that. I think people should feel empowered. There's a lot happening in our world. There's a lot of things that students might be confused by or upset about that they, interact with on a daily basis. And as long as you make them feel heard, that you understand that it's important to them, don't just say we don't talk about that here, because I think that that is dismissive and maybe doesn't give them feel agency or feel connected to you. But just saying, this is just not the time and place for it, that's okay,
Yeah.
especially if it's outside of the context of your class.
Well, you need to keep control over what's going on in terms of the conversation. And I think, understanding that yes, people can bring things that are connected to the class and talk about it is fine. If you're bringing things outside of that spectrum, you need to be able to define that as a professor, and you need to be able to adequately explain in a friendly manner why that doesn't necessarily connect to the class material. And I've not really ever had a lot of problems with that, but I know some people do, and it's really just a matter of like, can you maintain control in an appropriate manner over the flow of information and conversation in the class? And I think it's not that hard to do if you're focused on communicating clearly to students, both in the syllabus and in what you say on a lecture by lecture basis about how the thing is going to be conducted. I mean, certain classes you're going to want to invite that kind of thing, but other
Mhm.
classes you're not going to want to. And you need to understand that yourself as far as being a professor, what exactly belongs in this class and where's the flexibility or not.
And if it is something you invited, but something came up that you were not expecting, it's also okay to say, that's a different perspective than I've heard before. I'd like to do some more digging to understand it better. Tell me it from your perspective, and then we can put it in the parking lot because I'm in business. So I love the parking lot concept. We can put it in the parking lot and bring it out later once we've had a chance to kind of think through it. That is all fine. It's just a matter of communicating, why that might be the case. And that's another way to demonstrate, critical inquiry and how you approach as a professor, how you approach new information that you maybe don't know a lot about, because that's something we also need to model in today's world.
I agree.
Cool. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks for joining us again. Welcome to share any thoughts that you have. Looking forward to your comments. And if you are enjoying our podcast, please send it to friends or colleagues. I think it was last time Galen mentioned, my mom, I sent it to her. She was not that excited about it, but I sent it. So anybody that you think
Your
might get
mom
some
your
value from
mom
it.
didn't your mom didn't like the show?
It's not that she didn't like it. She was just like, this is not my world, which is true.
Alright. Hey, we just implored people to communicate honestly. I guess we have to take that the way that it was intended. So, yeah.
I'm sure she'll still listen for mentions of herself, I'm sure. So,
Yeah.
all right. Well, thanks everyone so much again, and we'll see you next time.